The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office hummed like angry wasps, casting everything in that particular shade of hospital green that makes healthy people look sick and sick people look dead. I sat in the leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, watching her shuffle through my file with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered life-altering news before lunch every day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Vivian, she said, finally looking up with those kind brown eyes that had seen too much. I'm afraid it's not the news we were hoping for. The words hung in the air like smoke. Stage 2 breast cancer. Aggressive. Treatment would start immediately. 6 months of chemotherapy, maybe radiation. The statistics rolled off her tongue with clinical precision, but all I could think about was how I was supposed to tell my family that their world was about to implode. My hands were shaking as I signed the treatment consent forms. 43 years old, a high school art teacher, a mother of twin 17-year-old boys who still needed their mom to remind them to wear deodorant. This wasn't supposed to happen to me. Cancer was something that happened to other people, older people, people who smoked, people who had family histories written in medical charts like genetic prophecies. The drive home to our split-level house in Maplewood felt like traveling through someone else's life. The tree-lined streets I'd driven for 15 years suddenly looked foreign, like I was seeing them through a filter that made everything slightly off-kilter. I pulled into our driveway behind Marcus's beat-up Honda and sat for a moment, watching my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked the same shoulder-length auburn hair, same freckles scattered across my nose like paint drops, same green eyes that my mother always said were my best feature. But I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides and left only the shell. The front door opened before I could gather the courage to go inside. Marcus, my husband of 20 years, stepped onto the porch with that crooked smile that still made my heart skip. He was wearing his favorite faded jeans and the blue button-down I'd given him for Christmas, the one that brought out his eyes. His dark hair was mussed from running his hands through it, something he did when he was nervous about my appointment. "How did it go?" he asked, jogging down the steps to meet me. I couldn't find the words. Instead, I fell into his arms and let the tears I'd been holding back in the doctor's office finally come. He held me tight against his chest, and I could feel his heart hammering as the reality of my silence sunk in. "We'll get through this," he whispered into my hair. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it." Inside, our boys, Dylan and Ethan, were sprawled on the living room couch, supposedly doing homework but actually playing some zombie game on their phones. They looked up when we walked in, their identical blue eyes, Marcus's eyes, immediately registering that something was wrong. "Mom?" Dylan asked, setting down his phone. He was the older twin by 3 minutes and had always been the more perceptive one. "What's going on?" I sat on the coffee table facing them, Marcus's hand warm on my shoulder. "I need to tell you guys something important," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "The test showed that I have breast cancer." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's face went completely white, while Dylan just stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "But you're going to be okay, right?" Ethan's voice cracked. At 17, he was nearly 6 feet tall and could bench press more than his father, but in that moment he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into our bed after nightmares. "I'm going to fight this with everything I have," I said, reaching for both their hands. "The doctors caught it early, and the treatment is very good these days. It's going to be hard, but we're going to get through it together." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and careful explanations. My parents, Marcus's parents, my sister Rachel, each conversation a fresh stab of reality. But it was the call I made to Marcus's sister Bethany that I should have seen coming. Bethany had always been challenging. Where Marcus was warm and easygoing, she was sharp-edged and judgmental. She'd found religion about 5 years ago, not the gentle, loving kind, but the fire and brimstone variety that she wielded like a weapon against anyone who didn't meet her increasingly rigid standards. She arrived at our house that evening without calling first, sweeping through our front door in her black wool coat like some sort of avenging angel. At 38, She was 5 years younger than Marcus but carried herself with the authority of someone who believed she had a direct line to divine truth. "I came as soon as I heard," she announced, pulling off her leather gloves with sharp, precise movements. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes, so much like Marcus's but somehow colder, swept over our living room like she was cataloging our failures. "Thanks for coming, Beth," Marcus said, though I could hear the tension in his voice. "The boys are upstairs doing homework, so we can talk." "Actually," I interrupted, standing from the couch where I'd been curled up under my favorite throw blanket, "I think I'll make some tea. Would you like some, Bethany?" She followed me into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown timer. I busied myself with the kettle, grateful for something to do with my hands while she stood behind me radiating disapproval. "I have to ask," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to say something cruel and rapid in concern. "Have you considered why this might be happening to you?" I turned around slowly, the kettle still in my hands. "What do you mean?" Bethany's mouth was set in a thin line, her arms crossed over her chest. "I mean that God doesn't afflict people randomly, Vivian. Cancer like this, it's often a sign. A wake-up call." The kettle slipped from my fingers, clattering against the counter. "Are you seriously suggesting that God gave me cancer?" "I'm suggesting that you might want to examine your life," she said, stepping closer. "Your lifestyle choices. The way you've been raising those boys. The books you teach at that school. The movies you watch. The company you keep." Heat flooded my cheeks. "Bethany, I teach high school art. I volunteer at the animal shelter. I've been married to your brother for 20 years. Your cancer is God's punishment," she said, the words dropping between us like stones. "For your rebellion against his will. For your pride. For thinking you know better than Scripture." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the wall ticking, the sound of my own heart breaking. In all the hours since the diagnosis, through all the fear and uncertainty and grief, nothing had hit me like this. Not the doctor's clinical explanation or the treatment timeline or even the look of terror in my children's eyes. This was different. This was personal in a way that made me feel small and dirty and somehow deserving of every cell that was betraying me. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "Vivian, I'm only trying to help. Get out." My voice was stronger now, fueled by a rage I didn't know I possessed. "Get out of my house. Now." Bethany's face shifted, surprise flickering across her features before hardening into righteousness. "I'll pray for you," she said as she gathered her coat. "I'll pray that you find the humility to accept God's correction." After she left, I stood in my kitchen and cried until there were no tears left. Marcus found me there an hour later, still gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping me upright. "What happened?" he asked, pulling me into his arms. I told him everything. Every poisonous word, every implication, every moment of that devastating conversation. I watched his face change from confusion to anger to something I'd never seen before. A cold fury that transformed my gentle husband into someone I barely recognized. "She said what?" His voice was deadly quiet. "Marcus, don't, no, Vivian. She doesn't get to do this. Not to you. Not now." He was already reaching for his phone, his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew meant there was no talking him out of whatever he was planning. But I caught his hand, stopping him. "Please," I said. "Not tonight. I can't. I can't deal with any more drama tonight." He looked at me for a long moment, then set the phone down and pulled me close again. "Tomorrow," he said into my hair. "Tomorrow I'm going to have words with my sister." But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept beside me, I wasn't thinking about tomorrow. I was thinking about Bethany's words, the absolute certainty in her voice when she delivered her verdict. I was thinking about the times I'd skipped church, the books I defended when parents complained about the curriculum, the way I'd raised my boys to think for themselves rather than follow blindly. Was she right? Was this somehow my fault? The thought was poison, but it was also seductive in its simplicity. If this was punishment, then maybe there was something I could do to make it stop. Maybe if I was better, holier, more righteous, the cancer would just disappear. I must have finally dozed off, because I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Marcus moving around downstairs. Sunlight was streaming through our bedroom windows, and for just a moment, that blessed space between sleep and full consciousness, I forgot. I was just Vivian Morrison, art teacher and mother, waking up on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Then reality crashed back, and I remembered. The diagnosis. The treatment. Bethany's words, but as I lay there in the growing light, something else was stirring. Something that felt less like despair and more like determination. I thought about my students, kids who came to my classroom seeking color in a world that often seemed gray. I thought about my boys, who needed to see their mother fight. I thought about Marcus, who had loved me through everything life had thrown at us, and I thought about Bethany, so certain in her judgment, so quick to see divine punishment where others might see random misfortune. She thought she knew who I was. She thought she had me figured out. She had no idea what was coming. I smiled for the first time since the diagnosis, and it felt like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Because if Bethany wanted to see what God's punishment looked like, I was more than happy to show her. After all, she'd forgotten one crucial detail about divine justice: sometimes it comes through the very people you've written off. And I was just getting started. I started researching Bethany that very morning. It sounds petty, vindictive even, but as I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that tasted like cardboard, I felt more focused than I had since. Walking out of Dr. Martinez's office, the fog of shock was lifting, replaced by something sharper and infinitely more dangerous. Marcus had left early for his contracting job, kissing my forehead and promising we'd talk more about the Bethany situation when he got home. The boys had shuffled off to school with backpacks full of worry and forced normalcy. And I was alone with my thoughts and a burning need to understand exactly who had appointed my sister-in-law as God's spokesperson. What I found was fascinating. Bethany Crawford, she'd kept her maiden name even after marrying Richard 5 years ago, claiming it was for professional reasons, had quite the digital footprint. Her Facebook page was a carefully curated shrine to her version of Christianity, full of scripture quotes about judgment and righteousness, photos from her women's Bible study group, and subtle digs at the moral decay of modern society. But it was her Instagram account that really caught my attention. Picture after picture of her perfectly decorated home, all whites and grays and expensive minimalism. Designer handbags. Luxury vacations to places like Napa Valley and Martha's Vineyard. Artisanal everything. Her husband Richard, a successful orthodontist, appeared in exactly 3 photos from the past year, always in the background, always looking vaguely uncomfortable for someone so concerned with spiritual purity. Bethany certainly enjoyed her material blessings. I scrolled back further, to before her religious awakening. The difference was startling. 5 years ago, she'd been posting about wine tastings and yoga retreats and book clubs. She'd shared articles about women's rights and environmental protection. She'd looked happy, relaxed, human. Then something had shifted. The timeline was clear. Richard's orthodontic practice had taken off right around the time Bethany found God. His income had tripled, they'd bought the house in Riverside Estates, and suddenly Bethany was posting about prosperity, gospel and divine favor. Interesting. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Rachel. How are you holding up? Want me to come over? I'm okay, I typed back. Actually working on something. Can we talk later? Of course. Love you. I loved Rachel too, but right now I needed to focus. Because the more I dug into Bethany's online presence, the more I found. Her LinkedIn profile listed her as a spiritual life coach, something that apparently involved charging desperate people $150 an hour for advice on how to align their lives with God's will. She had testimonials from clients who credited her with helping them find their divine purpose and break free from destructive patterns. One testimonial made my stomach turn. Bethany helped me understand that my miscarriage was God's way of preparing me for a greater blessing. Her wisdom gave me peace. This woman was making money off people's pain, packaging their trauma as divine plan and charging them for the privilege, but it was her blog that really opened my eyes. Walking in Divine Purpose was Bethany's platform for sharing her insights about living a godly life. The recent posts were a masterclass in spiritual manipulation. She wrote about how illness was often a sign of spiritual rebellion, how financial struggles indicated a lack of faith, how relationship problems stemmed from not submitting properly to God's will, and then I found it. A post from just 3 months ago titled, When God Uses Suffering to Sanctify. Sometimes the Lord must break us down before He can build us up. I've watched loved ones struggle with illness, addiction, and failure, and while my heart breaks for their pain, I've learned to see these trials as opportunities for divine intervention. Often, the people we're closest to are the ones God uses to deliver His most important messages. It's not always comfortable, but love sometimes means speaking hard truths. The post had dozens of comments praising Bethany's courage and spiritual insight. People sharing their own stories of how they'd learned to see their suffering as divine correction. A whole community of people who'd been convinced that their pain was somehow their fault. I closed the laptop and stared out my kitchen window at the maple tree Marcus had planted when we'd first moved in. 20 years of roots, 20 years of growth, 20 years of weathering storms and coming back stronger. Like our marriage. Like our family, like me. My phone rang. Dr. Martinez's office, confirming my appointment for Thursday to meet with the oncology team. Real life intruding on my research mission, reminding me that while I was plotting some kind of response to Bethany's cruelty, I had actual cancer cells multiplying in my body. Yes, I told the scheduler. Thursday at 2 works fine. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen and let myself feel the fear again. The raw, primal terror of not knowing if I'd see my boys graduate, if I'd grow old with Marcus, if I'd have enough time to matter in this world. The fear that maybe, in some twisted way, Bethany was right, but then I thought about that blog post, about the woman who'd been convinced her miscarriage was part of God's plan, about all the people Bethany was manipulating in the name of divine love, and the fear transformed into something else entirely. I reopened my laptop and started typing. By the time Marcus got home that evening, I had 15 pages of notes and a plan that was probably either brilliant or completely insane. He found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and sticky notes, looking like a detective working a cold case. "Please tell me you haven't been sitting here all day obsessing over my sister," he said, dropping his tool bag by the door and coming over to kiss the top of my head. "I wouldn't call it obsessing," I said, closing my laptop screen. "More like reconnaissance." He pulled out the chair next to me and sat down heavily. His hands were stained with paint and sawdust. He'd been working on the renovation of an old Victorian downtown, and he looked tired in the way that came from both physical labor and emotional weight. "Viv, I know you're angry. I'm angry too." What she said was unforgivable. "But maybe we should just, did you know she charges people $150 an hour to tell them their problems are their own fault?" Marcus blinked. "What?" I opened the laptop and showed him Bethany's coaching website, her testimonials, her blog posts. I watched his expression change from confusion to disgust as he read about her spiritual guidance business. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry. I know you don't like Marcus. She's built an entire career on convincing people that their suffering is divine punishment. She told a woman who had a miscarriage that it was God preparing her for something better. And now she's told me that my cancer is my fault." He was quiet for a long moment, scrolling through her blog posts. "I don't understand. When did she become this person? We grew up in the same house, went to the same church. Our parents raised us to be kind, to help people, to money," I said simply. "Look at the timeline. Her whole spiritual awakening coincides perfectly with Richard's practice taking off. She went from yoga and wine tastings to prosperity gospel and judgment in about 6 months. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "So what are you thinking? Expose her somehow? Call her out publicly? Something like that." I gathered my notes into a neat pile. "But I need to be smart about it. She has a platform, followers, people who believe in her message. If I go after her directly, I just look like a bitter cancer patient attacking a woman of faith." "So what then?" I smiled, and Marcus actually looked a little worried. "I'm going to become her client." The next morning, I called Bethany's office. Well, her home office. The number on her website went to their house in Riverside Estates. A perky assistant named Crystal answered and informed me that Bethany had a cancellation for Friday afternoon. Would I be interested in a spiritual life coaching session? "Actually," I said, disguising my voice slightly by lowering it and adding a slight southern accent I'd picked up from my college roommate, "I was hoping for something sooner. I'm going through a real crisis of faith, and a friend recommended Bethany specifically. She said Bethany had helped her understand that her illness was part of God's plan, There was a pause, then Crystal's voice became warmer, more conspiratorial. "Oh, you must mean Jennifer." "Yes, Bethany has such a gift for helping people see God's purpose in their trials." "Let me check, she has a lunch cancellation tomorrow. Could you do Wednesday at 1? "That would be perfect." I gave her the name Sarah Williams, my mother's maiden name combined with my grandmother's first name, and a prepaid credit card number I'd picked up that morning. Crystal emailed me an intake form that was basically a catalog of personal trauma disguised as spiritual assessment. Describe your current life challenges and how you believe God might be speaking to you through them. List any recent losses, illnesses, or setbacks you've experienced. How would you describe your relationship with divine authority? I spent an hour crafting the perfect responses. Sarah Williams was a 45-year-old woman struggling with infertility, recent job loss, and a crisis of faith. She'd been trying to have children for 10 years, had just been laid off from her marketing job, and was questioning whether God was punishing her for past mistakes. It was designed to be catnip for someone like Bethany, a woman desperate for answers, vulnerable to spiritual manipulation, and with enough surface similarities to my own situation that I could method act my way through the session. That evening, I practiced my southern accent with the boys during dinner. Dylan and Ethan thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but Marcus understood. He'd seen me prepare for community theater productions the same way, building a character from the inside out. "You're really going to do this," he said after the boys had gone upstairs. "She hurt me, Marcus. In the worst possible moment of my life, she kicked me when I was down and called it love. But more than that, she's hurting other people. She's making money off people's pain and calling it ministry. And what exactly do you plan to accomplish with this infiltration?" I pulled up a new document on my laptop. "I'm going to record everything. Every cruel thing she says, every manipulation, every moment she uses someone's vulnerability against them. And then I'm going to expose her for what she really is." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's actually pretty brilliant. And probably illegal. Illinois is a one-party consent state for recording. As long as I'm part of the conversation, it's perfectly legal." "You've really thought this through." "I have cancer, Marcus. I start chemo next week. I may not have a lot of fight left in me, but I'm going to use what I have to make sure she can't do this to anyone else." He reached over and took my hand. "What do you need from me?" "Just be ready to pick up the pieces if this goes badly." "It won't go badly," he said with a confidence I didn't quite feel. She messed with the wrong woman. Wednesday afternoon found me sitting in my car outside Bethany's house, checking my appearance in the rearview mirror. I'd dressed carefully, conservative but not too polished, the kind of outfit a woman in crisis might choose when trying to hold herself together. My recording app was running on my phone, tucked into my purse with the microphone pointed up. The house was everything I'd expected from her Instagram photos. White brick, manicured lawn, the kind of perfectly sterile beauty that screamed expensive. Good taste. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart hammering. Bethany answered wearing a flowing white blouse and perfectly pressed navy slacks. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup flawless but understated. She looked like every stock photo of a life coach ever taken. "Sarah," she said with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Bethany. Please, come in." The interior of the house was exactly what I'd expected, all white furniture and inspirational quotes in flowing script on the walls. She led me to what she called her consultation room, which was really just a formal living room with 2 chairs facing each other and a small table holding a box of tissues and a pitcher of water. "Please, have a seat," she said, settling into her chair with practiced grace. "I've reviewed your intake form, and I want you to know that what you're going through is more common than you might think. Many women struggle with feeling like God is withholding his blessings from them." I slipped into character, letting my voice take on that slight tremor of barely controlled emotion. "I just don't understand what I've done wrong. I've been trying to live right, to be a good person, but it feels like everything I touch falls apart." Bethany nodded sympathetically. "Tell me about your relationship with submission, Sarah. How do you respond when God's plan doesn't align with your own desires?" And just like that, she was off and running. For the next 45 minutes, I listened as my sister-in-law systematically dismantled Sarah Williams' self-worth in the name of spiritual guidance. Every setback was a sign of spiritual rebellion. Every disappointment was evidence of insufficient faith. Every moment of pain was God's way of correcting a stubborn heart. Infertility, she said with that same cold certainty she'd used in my kitchen, is often the Lord's way of telling us we're not ready for the responsibility of children. Perhaps you need to examine what areas of your life aren't surrendered to His will. I let a tear roll down my cheek, not difficult, considering the content of what she was saying, and watched as Bethany's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone landing a perfect blow. I know it's hard to hear, she continued, leaning forward with false compassion. But the truth is often painful. God loves us too much to leave us comfortable in our sin. By the time the session ended, I had everything I needed and then some. Bethany had revealed herself completely: the manipulation, the victim blaming, the way she weaponized people's faith against their own sense of worth. All of it recorded in crystal clear audio. As I wrote her a check for $150, she handed me a business card and a book she'd self-published called Embracing Divine Correction. "I think weekly sessions would be beneficial for you," she said. "You're clearly at a crossroads, and I believe God has brought you to me for a reason." "Thank you," I said, meaning something entirely different than what she thought. "This has been illuminating." I made it to my car before the rage hit. Sitting in her pristine driveway, I gripped the steering wheel and let myself feel the full weight of what I'd just experienced. The calculated cruelty, the practiced manipulation, the way she'd taken someone's pain and twisted it into a weapon against them. This wasn't ministry. This was abuse with a religious veneer, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. But first, I had a cancer treatment to survive. Because the beautiful irony was that while Bethany saw my illness as divine punishment, I was beginning to see it as something else entirely. A gift. A spotlight that would illuminate exactly who she really was. After all, if God was really speaking through suffering, then maybe He was about to deliver a message Bethany wasn't expecting, and I was more than happy to be His messenger. The chemotherapy port went into my chest on a Thursday morning, 3 days after my session with Bethany. As I lay on the surgical table watching the ceiling tiles blur past, I thought about the irony of timing. While I was being fitted with the device that would deliver poison into my bloodstream to save my life, I was also planning to deliver a different kind of poison into Bethany's carefully constructed world. Dr. Chen, the surgeon, was explaining the aftercare instructions when my phone buzzed with a text from Crystal, Bethany's assistant. "Bethany was so encouraged by your session. She's had a cancellation for Monday at 3 p.m. if you'd like to continue your spiritual journey." I texted back that Sarah Williams would be delighted to continue, then spent the drive home wondering if I was losing my mind. Normal people facing cancer. Focused on treatment, on fighting for their lives, on spending precious time with family. I was apparently channeling my terror into an elaborate revenge scheme against my sister-in-law. Marcus met me at the door, his face creased with worry. "How did it go?" I pulled down my shirt collar to show him the small, raised bump where the port sat beneath my skin. "I'm officially bionic. First chemo session is Monday." He traced the edge of the bandage with gentle fingers. "Same day as your next appointment with Bethany. Life's full of interesting parallels. Viv." He sat on the edge of our bed, pulling me down beside him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I could tell from his tone this was going to be one of those conversations that shifted the foundation of our marriage slightly, the kind that happened maybe once or twice a decade. "Are you doing this because you're angry at Bethany, or because you're angry at God?" The question hit me like cold water. I opened my mouth to give him the easy answer. Of course it was about Bethany, about her cruelty, about protecting other vulnerable people from her manipulation. But Marcus had known me for 20 years. He deserved better than easy answers. "I don't know," I said finally. "Maybe both. Maybe I need to believe that if I can prove she's wrong about me, about divine punishment, then maybe none of this is my fault." He was quiet for a moment, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of my hand. "And what if you're wrong? What if she really believes what she's saying? Then she's delusional and dangerous instead of just malicious and dangerous. But either way, she's still dangerous." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Okay. Then we do this right. No half measures, no backing down when it gets ugly. If we're going to take her down, we take her down completely." The next morning brought our first real test. Dylan came downstairs for breakfast moving like he was walking through molasses, his usually bright eyes dull and unfocused. "You okay, kiddo?" I asked, pouring orange juice into his glass. Yeah, just. He slumped into his chair, picking at his scrambled eggs. I had this weird dream about Aunt Bethany. She was standing at the foot of my bed telling me that you were going to die because our family wasn't righteous enough. My fork clattered against my plate. Ethan looked up from his phone, suddenly alert. She said, "What in your dream?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. "It was just a dream, Dad. But it felt so real. And she kept quoting all this Bible stuff about how God punishes the children for the sins of the fathers, or something like that." I reached across the table and took Dylan's hand. "Listen to me, both of you. Dreams are just our brains processing stuff we're worried about. Your subconscious probably took what happened the other night and mixed it up with all the scary feelings about my diagnosis." "But what if she tries to talk to us?" Ethan asked. "What if she comes to school or something?" "She won't," Marcus said firmly. "And if she does, you call me immediately. You don't engage, you don't argue, you just walk away and call." After the boys left for school, Marcus and I sat in the kitchen staring at each other across the debris of breakfast. "She's already in their heads," I said. "Which is exactly why we can't let this go. She made it personal when she blamed you for your cancer. But going after our kids, even in a dream." Marcus stood up abruptly, grabbing his keys. "I'm going to have a conversation with my sister." "Marcus, wait, no. I've been patient long enough. She wants to play God? Fine. But she doesn't get to terrorize my children in the process." I caught his arm. "If you go over there angry, you'll just give her ammunition. She'll say you're attacking her faith, that we're persecuting her for speaking truth. You'll make her look like the victim. So what do you suggest?" "We stick to the plan. I gather more evidence, we build an airtight case, and then we destroy her credibility completely. But we do it smart." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then set his keys back on the counter. "This is really important to you, isn't it? Not just getting back at her, but doing it the right way." "It's important because it's not just about me anymore. Dylan's having nightmares about divine punishment. How many other kids is she affecting? Through her coaching business? How many families is she destroying with her twisted theology?" He pulled me into his arms, careful of the port sight. "Okay. We do this your way. But if she comes anywhere near our boys again, she won't get the chance." Monday arrived with the kind of gray October drizzle that makes everything look washed out and tired. I sat in the oncology waiting room at 10 a.m., watching other patients with various stages of hair loss and trying not to think about what I'd look like in 3 months. The woman next to me was reading a book called God's Healing Power and highlighting passages with a yellow marker. "First time?" she asked, noticing my stare. "Yeah. You. Number 12. Ovarian cancer, stage 3. She held up the book. "This has been such a comfort. Really helps you understand that God has a plan for everything, even this." I wanted to ask if she thought God's plan included giving her cancer, if she'd examined her life for signs of spiritual rebellion, if she understood that her suffering might be divine correction. Instead, I just smiled and wished her luck. Dr. Patel, my oncologist, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who treated cancer like a chess match against a particularly cunning opponent. She walked me through the treatment protocol with the same calm efficiency she probably used to order lunch. "The first round is always the hardest psychologically," she said as the nurse prepared my for. "After this, you'll know what to expect. The anticipation is usually worse than the reality." The chemotherapy drugs went into my port through a line that felt strangely warm, like drinking hot chocolate from the inside out. I'd brought headphones and a playlist I'd made specifically for this moment, songs that made me feel strong, defiant, ready to fight. But as the poison designed to save my life flowed into my bloodstream, all I could think about was Bethany's voice. "Your cancer is God's punishment." By the time I drove to my appointment with her at 3 p.m., I was already feeling the beginnings of the fatigue that would become my constant companion. My mouth tasted like copper pennies, and there was a strange hollow feeling behind my sternum that had nothing to do with the port. Bethany answered her door wearing a cream-colored sweater. That probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She took one look at my face and her expression shifted to practiced concern. "Sarah, dear, you look exhausted. Are you feeling all right?" "I've been having a rough few days," I said, letting my voice carry the weight of genuine fatigue. "I keep Thinking about what you said last week, about God trying to tell me something through my struggles. She led me to her consultation room, where she'd added a small diffuser sending lavender-scented steam into the air. The tissues were positioned at a more strategic angle, and there was a new inspirational poster on the wall. His plans for you are good. I've been praying about your situation, she said once we were seated. And I keep coming back to the same message. Sometimes God allows us to hit rock bottom so we have nowhere to look but up. I pulled out a small notebook and pen. Would you mind if I took notes? I want to make sure I remember everything. Of course. In fact, I encourage all my clients to journal their spiritual journey. It helps you see patterns in God's correction. For the next hour, I listened as Bethany wove an increasingly elaborate theology of suffering. According to her interpretation, every setback in Sarah's life was connected to some spiritual failing. The job loss was punishment for pride. The infertility was correction for selfishness. Even minor things, a flat tire the previous week, a fight with my husband, were signs that I was living outside God's will. The beautiful thing about divine discipline, she said, leaning forward with that predatory gleam in her eyes, is that it's always perfectly tailored to what we need to learn. Your specific struggles are custom designed by God to break down the areas where you're resisting His authority. I wrote everything down, occasionally asking her to clarify or elaborate. She was so pleased with my apparent receptiveness that she became increasingly bold in her pronouncements. I had another client recently, she said, clearly violating confidentiality without a second thought, who was struggling with a serious illness. She kept asking, why me? But I helped her understand that the real question was, what is God trying to teach me? Once she stopped fighting His correction and started embracing it, she found such peace. What kind of illness? I asked, my pen poised. Cancer, actually. Breast cancer. She was so angry at first, blaming everyone and everything except her own spiritual condition. But through our work together, she came to see it as God's mercy, His way of getting her attention before she strayed too far from His path. My hand was shaking slightly as I wrote this down. She was talking about me. About our family tragedy. She was using my cancer diagnosis as a case study for her twisted theology, probably charging some other desperate woman to hear about how God gives people cancer for their own good. That's incredible, I managed. Did she recover? Oh, she's still in treatment. But spiritually? She's never been healthier. That's what real healing looks like, when we align ourselves with God's purposes instead of fighting against them. I wanted to vomit. Not from the chemotherapy, though that was contributing, but from the realization that Bethany had turned my private hell into content for her coaching sessions. She was monetizing my suffering, literally profiting from the worst moment of my life. I'd love to meet her, I said carefully. It would be so encouraging to talk to someone who's been through something similar. Bethany's smile became strained. Oh, that wouldn't be appropriate. Client confidentiality, you understand. But I can tell you that her transformation has been remarkable. She's become so much more submissive to her husband, more grateful for her blessings, less focused on worldly concerns. More submissive to her husband. I thought about Marcus, about the way he'd held me while I cried, the way he'd supported every decision I'd made about treatment, the way he'd never once suggested that I should be more grateful or submissive or accepting of divine correction. That sounds wonderful, I lied. I hope I can learn to be more like her. I believe you can, Bethany said, reaching over to pat my hand. In fact, I think your willingness to receive correction is a sign that God is already working in your heart. Some people are too proud, too stubborn to accept His discipline. They fight against it until it destroys them. What happens to those people? Her smile was cold and satisfied. They learn the hard way that you can't win a war against God. Their suffering just gets worse until they surrender, or until it's too late. I left that session with 17 pages of notes and a recording that would make any reasonable person question Bethany's fitness to counsel anyone, let alone vulnerable people in crisis. But more than that, I left with absolute clarity about what I was dealing with. This wasn't about religious differences or family drama. This was about a predator who used people's faith against them, who fed on their pain and convinced them they deserved it. She wasn't just wrong, she was dangerous, and I was going to stop her. That evening, I transcribed my notes while Marcus made dinner. The boys were upstairs doing homework, the house filled with the ordinary sounds of a family going about their evening routine. But I felt like I was living in two worlds simultaneously, the normal one where cancer was something we were fighting together, and the shadow world where my suffering was being dissected and repackaged as spiritual content. Listen to this, I said when Marcus came to check on my progress. I read him the section about Bethany's other cancer patient, watching his face grow darker with each word. She's talking about you, he said when I finished. She's using your diagnosis to manipulate other people. And probably charging them extra for the insider perspective. Marcus sat down across from me, his dinner forgotten. Viv, this is bigger than we thought. If she's doing this to you, if she's using other people's medical information in her sessions, she's violating every ethical boundary that exists. The question is, how do we prove it without exposing my identity? What if we don't have to? What if we can get other people to come forward? I looked up from my transcripts. What do you mean? I mean, she's been doing this for 5 years. There have to be other people she's hurt, other clients who figured out that her spiritual guidance was actually emotional abuse. If we can find them, we could build a class action case. Not just about the manipulation, but about the way she's using people's private information in other sessions. Marcus pulled out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer friend Tom. He'll know what kind of evidence we need and how to protect you in the process. As he made the call, I stared at my notes. Tomorrow, I'd have my second chemotherapy session. By the end of the week, I'd probably start losing my hair. In a month, I'd look like the cancer patient Bethany expected me to be: weak, defeated, broken down by divine correction, but she had no idea what was really happening. While she thought she was watching me crumble under God's judgment, I was actually gathering the evidence that would bring her entire operation crashing down. The irony was perfect. If Bethany truly believed that God spoke through suffering, then maybe she should start listening more carefully. Because my cancer wasn't making me submissive or grateful or accepting of her twisted theology. It was making me absolutely ruthless, and she was about to learn the difference between divine punishment and earthly justice, delivered by a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Tom Rafferty had been Marcus's friend since college, but I'd never seen him in full lawyer mode before. He sat in our living room on a rainy Tuesday evening, his usually casual demeanor replaced by laser-focused intensity as he reviewed my transcripts and recordings. This is a goldmine, he said, looking up from the documents. Professional misconduct, violation of client confidentiality, potential fraud if she's misrepresenting her credentials. But Vivian, I have to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? I touched the bandana covering my head. 3 weeks of chemotherapy had taken my hair, but it had also crystallized my resolve. What do you mean? When this goes public, and it will go public, your identity comes out too. Your cancer diagnosis, your family situation, everything becomes part of the public record. Are you ready for that level of exposure? Marcus reached for my hand. We've talked about it. She's ready. Actually, I said, surprising both of them. I've been thinking about that. What if we don't wait for this to go public? What if we control the narrative from the beginning? Tom raised an eyebrow. Explain. I pulled out my laptop and opened a document I'd been working on for the past week. What if Sarah Williams doesn't just disappear? What if she has a very public crisis of faith right in the middle of one of Bethany's group sessions? Tom was already shaking his head. Vivian, that's brilliant, Marcus interrupted. What are you thinking? Bethany's been pushing me to join her women's group. Divine Sisterhood, or something equally nauseating. 20 women, meeting every Thursday night, sharing their struggles and receiving Bethany's guidance on how their suffering is actually God's love. You want to record a group session, Tom said slowly. In front of 20 witnesses. I want to do more than that. I want to break character right in the middle of her routine. Show these women exactly what they're paying for. Tom set down his pen. That's actually not the worst idea. If you can get multiple witnesses to Bethany's methods, it strengthens the case exponentially. But it's also incredibly risky. If she figures out who you are before you're ready, she won't. I've been Sarah Williams for a month now. She trusts me, thinks I'm her success story. I'm the grateful cancer patient who learned to accept God's correction. The words tasted like ash, but they were true. In our last session, Bethany had practically glowed as she described my transformation, from bitter victim to humble recipient of divine discipline. She'd even suggested that I might become a testimonial for her website. What about the legal implications? Marcus asked Tom. If she records a group session, Illinois law is clear. As long as one party consents to the recording, it's legal. But Vivian. Tom looked at me seriously. You understand that once you do this, there's no going back. You'll be burning every bridge with Marcus's family, potentially exposing yourself to retaliation, definitely facing a media circus when the story breaks. Tom, I said quietly, I have stage 2 breast cancer. I'm poisoning my body with chemotherapy and hoping it works. I may not have much time left to make a difference in this world. If I can stop one person from being told that their suffering is their own fault, if I can prevent one family from being destroyed by her manipulation, then it's worth whatever comes next. Marcus squeezed my hand. We're in. Tom nodded slowly. All right. But we do this smart. I'll reach out to some contacts at the state licensing board, see what kind of documentation they'd need for a formal complaint. And I'll start quietly looking for other clients who might be willing to come forward. Actually, I said, I might already have a lead on that. Her name was Jennifer Kowalski, and I found her through Bethany's Facebook page. She'd commented on one of Bethany's inspirational posts about embracing divine correction, with a series of crying face emojis and the words, "This saved my life." Her profile was mostly private, but what I could see painted a picture of a woman in her 30s struggling with depression and relationship issues. I messaged her as Sarah Williams, explaining that I was one of Bethany's clients and wondering if she'd be willing to share her experience. Her response came within an hour. Sarah, Bethany mentioned you in our last session. She said you're going through something similar to what I dealt with. I'd love to talk. Would you like to meet for coffee? We met at a Starbucks halfway between Maplewood and her apartment in the city. Jennifer was smaller than I'd expected, with the kind of fragile beauty that made you want to handle her carefully. She was already seated when I arrived, nursing a latte and checking her phone with nervous energy. Sarah, she said, standing as I approached. I'm so glad you reached out. It's nice to meet someone else who's experienced Bethany's gift. I ordered a coffee I wouldn't be able to drink. Chemo had made everything taste like metal, and sat across from her. She mentioned that you'd been through something similar to my situation. I hope you don't mind me asking. Oh, not at all. Actually, talking about it helps. I had a miscarriage about 18 months ago. My third one. I was so angry, so lost. I kept asking God why he was doing this to me, why he wouldn't let me have a baby. My heart clenched. This was the woman from Bethany's testimonials, the one who'd been convinced that her miscarriages were part of God's plan. That must have been devastating, I said gently. It was. But then I found Bethany, and she helped me understand that I was looking at it all wrong. She showed me that God wasn't punishing me, he was preparing me. Each loss was teaching me something about surrender, about trusting his timing instead of my own. Jennifer's eyes were bright with conviction, and I realized with sick clarity that she genuinely believed what she was saying. Bethany hadn't just manipulated her, she'd converted her. How did she help you see that? I asked, my phone recording every word. She asked me to examine my life, to really look at whether I was living in submission to God's will. And when I was honest, I realized that I'd been putting my own desires above his plan. I wanted children more than I wanted to serve him. I was treating pregnancy like something I deserved instead of something he might choose to bless me with. So you think the miscarriages were God's way of teaching me humility, of showing me that his timeline isn't my timeline. And you know what? It worked. I stopped trying to get pregnant, stopped the fertility treatments, focused on becoming the woman God wanted me to be. And now, she smiled with the kind of peace that looked suspiciously like resignation. Now I'm content with whatever he has planned for me. I wanted to reach across the table and shake her, to tell her that there was nothing divine about her suffering. That losing 3 babies wasn't a lesson in humility but a tragedy that deserved compassion, not correction. Instead, I nodded sympathetically. That's beautiful, Jennifer. How long have you been working with Bethany? About a year. I still see her monthly, and I'm part of her women's group. Actually, you should come Thursday night. It's so powerful. To hear how God is working in other women's lives through their trials. I'd love that. What's it like? Jennifer's expression became almost evangelical. Life-changing. There are about 20 of us, all in different stages of accepting God's correction. Some are dealing with illness, others with financial struggles, relationship problems, career setbacks. But Bethany helps us see the common thread: how our suffering is actually God's mercy in disguise. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos from recent group meetings. 20 women sitting in a circle in what looked like a church fellowship hall, some crying, others nodding in apparent understanding. Bethany stood at the center like a conductor orchestrating their pain. This woman here, Jennifer pointed to a photo of a middle-aged black woman with short gray hair, has been battling lupus for 3 years. She used to be so bitter about it, but Bethany helped her see that her illness was God's way of slowing her down, of teaching her to depend on Him instead of her own strength. And this one, she pointed to a younger woman who looked about my age, lost her job 6 months ago. She was furious at first, but now she understands that God was protecting her from pride, from becoming too attached to worldly success. Each photo was a catalog of human suffering reframed as divine intervention. Cancer, infertility, unemployment, divorce, addiction, depression, all of it transformed by Bethany's theology into evidence of God's loving correction. It sounds incredible, I managed. I'd definitely like to come to the next meeting. Perfect. I'll text you the details. Oh, and Sarah? Jennifer reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I know you're going through a hard time right now, but I want you to know that you're in the right hands. Bethany has such a gift for helping people see God's purpose in their pain. Whatever you're facing, she'll help you understand why it's actually a blessing. I smiled and thanked her, but as I drove home, I felt like I was going to be sick. And not from the chemotherapy. That evening, I sat in our bedroom showing Marcus the photos Jennifer had shared. Each image was a testament to Bethany's reach, to the community of broken people she'd convinced that their brokenness was their fault. 20 women, I said, scrolling through the pictures. 20 people paying her to tell them that their worst moments are actually God's gifts. The lupus patient, Marcus said, pointing to one of the photos. Do you think she still believes that if her condition gets worse? That's the beauty of Bethany's system. If you get better, it's because you accepted God's correction. If you get worse, it's because you're still fighting His will. Either way, she's right and you're wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Thursday 7 p.m. at Grace Community Church, 425, Oak Street. Can't wait for you to meet everyone. This is going to be such a blessing. Thursday, I told Marcus. That's when I bring down her entire operation. Are you sure you're ready for this? Physically, I mean. You just had chemo on Monday. I looked at myself in the mirror on our dresser. The bandana couldn't hide how thin my face had become, how the treatment was hollowing me out from the inside. But my eyes were clear and determined. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Besides, looking sick will just make the revelation more powerful. When I tell those women that I'm the cancer patient Bethany's been using as a success story, when they see what her divine correction really looks like, they'll realize they've been manipulated. Some of them will. Others. I thought about Jennifer's convinced expression, her grateful acceptance of her own suffering. Others might be too far gone to save. But even if I can reach half of them, even if I can plant seeds of doubt, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed. Tom thinks we should wait, build a stronger legal case first. Tom's thinking like a lawyer. I'm thinking like a teacher. I turned to face him. When a student is being bullied, you don't wait to gather evidence. You stop it immediately, before more damage is done. These women are being spiritually abused, and it's happening Thursday night whether we're ready or not. What do you need from me? Just be ready to catch me when this all comes crashing down. Because once I do this, there's no taking it back. He stood and pulled me into his arms, careful not to disturb the port in my chest. I'll be here. Whatever happens, however bad it gets, I'll be here. That night, I lay awake planning exactly what I would say to those 20 women. How I would reveal myself, how I would expose Bethany's methods, how I would give them permission to be angry about their suffering instead of grateful for it, but I also thought about the other possibility, that they would reject what I had to say, that they would choose to believe Bethany over their own eyes, that they would see my revelation not as liberation but as an attack on their faith. Either way, Thursday night would change everything. For them, for Bethany, for me. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what it would feel like to finally stop pretending, to stand up in that circle of broken women and say the words that had been burning inside me for weeks. My name is not Sarah Williams. I am Vivian Morrison, and I have cancer. But it is not God's punishment. It is not divine correction. It is not a blessing in disguise. It is a disease, and the only thing it has taught me is that some people will use your worst moments against you if you let them, and I will not let them. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Thursday arrived with a clarity that felt almost supernatural. I woke before dawn, my body still aching from Tuesday's chemotherapy, but my mind sharper than it had been in weeks. Through our bedroom window, I could see the first hints of sunrise painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It felt like an omen. Marcus was already up, standing in our kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, though he knew I couldn't drink mine. The gesture was purely symbolic, his way of maintaining our morning ritual even as everything else fell apart. "How are you feeling?" he asked, studying my face for signs of doubt or weakness. "Like I'm about to jump off a cliff." I accepted the cup anyway, wrapping my hands around its warmth. "But it's a cliff I chose to climb." The boys had left early for school, but not before Dylan hugged me with unusual intensity. "You're going to be okay, right, Mom?" he'd whispered against my shoulder. "Whatever you're doing today, you're going to be okay?" Smart kid. He could sense the shift in the household's energy, the way Marcus and I had been moving around each other with the careful precision of people preparing for battle. "I'm going to be better than okay," I'd told him, meaning it in ways he couldn't understand now. 3 hours later, I sat in my car outside Grace Community Church, watching other women arrive for the Divine Sisterhood meeting. I recognized several faces from Jennifer's photos: the lupus patient walking slowly with a cane, the unemployed woman in clothes that had seen better days, others whose tragedies I could only guess at. They all moved with the same careful demeanor, the practiced posture of people who'd learned to carry their pain quietly. Bethany's success stories. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom: "Legal team is standing by. Whatever happens tonight, we're ready to move fast." "You sure about this?" "Never been more sure of anything," I typed back. Another text, this one from Rachel: "I know I don't know exactly what you're planning, but I love you. Dad would be proud." That one nearly broke my resolve. My father had died when I was 25, too young to see me teach my first class or marry Marcus or have his grandchildren. But he'd lived through the Depression, survived World War II, and taught me that sometimes the only way through hell was straight ahead. Tonight felt like straight ahead. I checked my recording equipment one final time, phone in my purse, backup device clipped inside my jacket, everything positioned for optimal audio. Then I walked toward the church basement, my legs steadier than they'd been in weeks. Jennifer met me at the door, her face glowing with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for birthday parties. "Sarah, I'm so excited you're here. Tonight's going to be special." Bethany said she has a particular testimony to share about divine correction through illness. Of course she did. She was probably planning to use my story again, to tell this room full of broken women about the cancer patient who'd learned to see her disease as God's mercy. The fellowship hall was arranged exactly as I'd expected: 20 folding chairs in a circle, boxes of tissues strategically placed, a table with coffee and cookies that no one would touch because everyone was too nervous to eat. The walls were covered with inspirational posters featuring sunset photos and flowing script: "His plans are always good, trust in his timing, beauty from ashes." I took my assigned seat next to Jennifer, directly across from where Bethany would hold court. The other women filed in quietly, nodding at each other with the kind of weary recognition that comes from shared suffering. Most were between 30 and 60, representing every demographic except happiness. Bethany entered at exactly 7 o'clock, wearing a flowing white dress that made her look like she was auditioning for the role of an angel. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her smile radiating the kind of peace that came from never questioning whether you might be wrong. "Good evening, sisters," she said, taking her place at the center of our circle. "Before we begin tonight's sharing, I want us to take a moment to thank God for bringing us together through our various trials. Remember, you're not here by accident. Each struggle that led you to this room was divinely orchestrated to bring you to this moment of growth and understanding." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. I bit my tongue. "Tonight, I want to talk about acceptance," Bethany continued. About the difference between suffering that purifies and suffering that destroys. The difference is always the same, our attitude toward God's correction. She began walking around the circle, her voice taking on that hypnotic cadence I'd come to recognize. Some people, when faced with trials, shake their fist at heaven. They demand explanations, insist on their own understanding, refuse to accept that God's ways are higher than their ways. And what happens to them? Their suffering multiplies. Several women responded in unison, clearly a practiced call and response. Exactly. But you, my beautiful sisters, have chosen the path of wisdom. You've learned to see your trials as invitations, your pain as purification, your losses as preparation for greater blessings. I watched the faces around the circle. Some nodded eagerly, others looked uncertain, a few seemed lost in private grief. The lupus patient, her name tag read Margaret, stared at her hands with the hollow expression of someone barely holding on. I want to share a testimony tonight, Bethany said, returning to her central position. About a woman who came to me with a particularly challenging diagnosis. Breast cancer. Stage 2. Aggressive. My heart stopped. She was actually going to do it. Tell my story to my face while I sat in disguise among her victims. When she first came to me, she was full of rage. Rage at God, rage at her circumstances, rage at anyone who suggested that there might be a divine purpose in her suffering. She couldn't understand why a loving God would allow such a disease to ravage her body. Several women leaned forward, drawn into the narrative. I saw Jennifer nodding sympathetically, remembering her own initial anger. But through our work together, she began to see the truth. Her cancer wasn't a punishment, it was a gift. God was using her illness to break down her pride, to strip away her self-reliance, to teach her complete dependence on His will. Margaret, the lupus patient, wiped her eyes. A woman I didn't recognize whispered amen. And the transformation was beautiful to witness, Bethany continued, her voice growing more animated. She stopped fighting the treatment, stopped demanding answers, stopped trying to control her outcome. She learned to trust that whether she lived or died, whether she suffered or was healed, God's plan was perfect. I felt something crack inside my chest, a sound like ice breaking in spring. Not the cancer, this was deeper, cleaner. This was the sound of my last restraint snapping. And now, Bethany said, her smile becoming predatory, she's become one of my greatest success stories. A woman who truly understands that our sufferings are gifts from a loving Father who knows exactly what we need to become who He wants us to be. The room was completely silent except for the soft sound of crying. These women were absorbing my story, my pain, my private hell, and finding inspiration in what they thought was my surrender. Sarah, Bethany said suddenly, turning to me with that practiced compassion. I know you're going through your own health challenges. Would you like to share what God has been teaching you through your struggles? This was it. The moment I'd been planning for weeks. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on me. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Bethany's smile flickered. Oh? The woman you just described, the cancer patient who learned to see her disease as God's gift. I reached up and pulled off my bandana, revealing my bald head to the room. That's me. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming, the coffee maker gurgling in the corner, my own heart hammering in my chest. My name is not Sarah Williams, I continued, looking directly at Bethany's rapidly paling face. I'm Vivian Morrison. I'm 43 years old, I teach high school art, I have twin sons, and yes, I have breast cancer. But everything else you just told these women is a lie. Jennifer gasped beside me. Several other women looked confused, glancing between Bethany and me like they were watching a tennis match. I never learned to see my cancer as a gift, I said, my voice growing stronger. I never stopped fighting my treatment or demanding answers. I never became grateful for my suffering or accepting of divine correction. And I certainly never gave you permission to use my private medical information as inspiration porn for your group sessions. Bethany found her voice. Sarah, I think you're having some kind of emotional breakdown. The treatments can affect your thinking. Stop. The word came out like a whip crack. Stop talking. Stop manipulating. Stop lying to these women about what God wants from them. I turned to address the group directly. I've been recording our sessions for the past month. I have documentation of how Bethany violates client confidentiality, how she charges you money to tell you that your pain is your fault, how she's built a business on convincing vulnerable people that they deserve their suffering. Margaret, the lupus patient, spoke up in a voice barely above a whisper. Is it true? Did she really share someone else's private medical information? It's true, I said gently. And I'm betting she shared details about your lupus with other clients too. Your struggle, your pain, your private moments of despair, all of it becomes content for her coaching sessions. I saw understanding dawn in Margaret's eyes, followed immediately by horror. This is spiritual warfare, Bethany said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. Satan is using this woman's illness to attack our ministry, to steal the peace you found through accepting God's discipline. Enough. The shout came from an unexpected source, a woman in her 50s I hadn't paid much attention to before. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Enough of your poison. She turned to face the group. My name is Dr. Patricia Hendricks. I'm a licensed therapist, and I've been coming here for 3 months trying to understand what happened to my daughter. The room seemed to hold its breath. My daughter Laura was one of Bethany's clients 2 years ago. She was struggling with postpartum depression after her first baby. Bethany convinced her that her depression was God's punishment for not being grateful enough for motherhood, that she needed to stop her medication and trust in divine healing instead. My stomach dropped. Laura stopped taking her antidepressants. She stopped seeing her actual therapist. She focused on becoming more submissive to God's will. And 6 months later, she took her own life. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock, this was horror. I've been documenting everything, Dr. Hendricks continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking. Recording sessions, gathering evidence, building a case against this woman who convinced my daughter that wanting to live was a sign of spiritual rebellion. Bethany's face had gone completely white. Patricia, your daughter's death was a tragedy. But you can't blame, I can and I do. Dr. Hendricks pulled out her phone. And now I have 20 witnesses to your methods, your confidentiality violations, your systematic abuse of vulnerable people. The dam burst. Women began standing, speaking, sharing stories I hadn't heard before. The woman who'd lost her job revealed that Bethany had told her to stop applying for work and trust God to provide, leaving her family homeless for 3 months. Another had been convinced to leave her allegedly ungodly husband, destroying her marriage based on Bethany's interpretation of spiritual submission. Margaret stood shakily, using her cane for support. You told me my lupus would improve if I had more faith. You said I should reduce my medication and pray harder. I almost died last month because I followed your advice instead of my doctor's. Jennifer looked around the room with growing horror. But you helped me understand my miscarriages. You showed me God's purpose in my pain. I knelt beside her chair. Jennifer, losing 3 babies wasn't God's plan. It was a medical tragedy that deserved compassion, not correction. You didn't fail some spiritual test. You experienced something terrible, and instead of helping you heal, she convinced you to be grateful for it. I watched Jennifer's face as the implications sank in. The grief she'd been taught to transform into gratitude came rushing back, raw and immediate. She doubled over in her chair, sobbing with the kind of primal pain that comes from finally allowing yourself to mourn what you've lost. Bethany made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Sisters, please. You're letting fear override faith. The enemy is using your emotions against the truth God has revealed through our work together. Get out. Dr. Hendricks's voice cut through Bethany's pleading. Get out before I call the police. And if you contact any of these women again, if you continue practicing without proper licensing, if you harm one more person with your spiritual abuse, I will make sure you face every legal consequence available. Bethany gathered her things with shaking hands, her perfect composure finally cracking. At the door, she turned back to the room full of women she'd manipulated and exploited. You'll regret this, she said, her mask slipping completely. All of you. When your suffering multiplies because you rejected God's correction, when your lives fall apart because you chose rebellion over submission, remember that you were warned. No, I said, standing in the center of the circle. When our lives get better because we stop blaming ourselves for random tragedy, when we find actual healing instead of manufactured gratitude, when we learn to fight our battles instead of Surrendering to them, we'll remember that we were set free. The door slammed behind her, leaving 20 women in various stages of emotional collapse and awakening. It was going to be a long night. But for the first time since my diagnosis, I felt like I could breathe. The revelation was over. Now came the real work of healing, not from divine correction, but from the damage done by someone who'd convinced them they didn't deserve better, and I was going to help them remember that they did. The church basement fell into a strange kind of silence after Bethany left, not the empty quiet of before, but the heavy stillness that follows an explosion. 20 women sat among the wreckage of their carefully constructed belief systems, and I found myself at the center of it all, bald and exhausted and somehow responsible for what came next. Dr. Hendricks was the first to move, walking over to Jennifer, who was still sobbing in her chair. "Honey," she said gently, kneeling beside her, "it's okay to grieve. You should have been grieving all along." Margaret, the lupus patient, looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than they had an hour ago. "How long?" she asked. "How long were you planning this?" "Since the night she told me my cancer was God's punishment," I said, settling back into my chair. My legs felt weak, but not from the chemotherapy. "Since she took the worst moment of my life and told me I deserved it." "She's your sister-in-law," said a woman I hadn't heard speak before. Her name tag read Linda. "How did you? I mean, didn't she recognize you?" I almost laughed. Bethany hasn't really looked at me in years. I was just the wife, the unemployed wife who couldn't get her act together. She saw what she expected to see. Dr. Hendricks stood and addressed the group. "I need everyone to understand something. What happened here tonight, it's just the beginning. If you're willing, we can build a case that ensures she can't do this to anyone else. But that means coming forward, going public, potentially facing her retaliation." "What kind of retaliation?" asked Margaret. "She'll claim religious persecution. She'll say we're attacking faith itself, not just her methods. She'll probably try to contact your families, your churches, anyone who might believe her version of events." I thought about Dylan's nightmare, about Bethany's words echoing in my son's subconscious. She's already started. She's been spreading her poison through families for years. Linda raised her hand tentatively. "What if some of us aren't ready? What if we need time to process all this?" "Then you take time," I said firmly. "No one here owes anyone else their story or their participation. You've been manipulated enough. From now on, every choice is yours." Jennifer finally looked up, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "I don't understand how I didn't see it. 3 babies, 3 times I thought God was testing me, teaching me something. How could I be so stupid?" "You weren't stupid," Dr. Hendricks said. "You were vulnerable and in pain, and someone took advantage of that. It's textbook spiritual abuse, using religious authority to control and manipulate. My daughter wasn't stupid either. She was suffering from a medical condition and was convinced by someone in a position of trust that her treatment was somehow sinful." Margaret slowly stood, gripping her cane. "I want to be part of whatever legal action you're taking. She told me to reduce my lupus medication because it showed a lack of faith. I ended up in the ICU for a week because my kidneys started failing." "Jesus," Linda whispered. "Don't," I said quickly. "Don't use his name to express shock at what someone did in his name. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that faith isn't supposed to make you smaller. Real faith doesn't tell you to be grateful for suffering or to accept abuse as correction." A woman in the back of the circle, I thought her name was Carol, spoke up for the first time. "So what do we do now? How do we trust anything again?" The question hung in the air like incense. It was the real work, the hard work that would take years instead of months. "Carefully," I said. "We trust carefully, and we trust people who earn it. We ask questions instead of accepting answers. We demand evidence instead of having faith in authority. And we remember that anyone who tells you that questioning them is a sin is probably someone you should run from." Dr. Hendricks nodded. "There are real therapists, real spiritual counselors who don't use your pain against you. People who help you heal instead of convincing you to be grateful for your wounds." Over the next 2 hours, we talked. Really talked. Not the careful, performed sharing that Bethany had orchestrated. Women shared their real stories, not the sanitized versions where suffering led to spiritual growth, but the raw, honest accounts of loss and confusion and anger. Margaret had been living with lupus for 15 years, but only the last 3 had been managed through Bethany's faith-based approach. Before that, she'd been stable, working, living a full life. Bethany had convinced her that her medications were a crutch, that true faith meant trusting God alone for healing. Linda had lost her teaching job 2 years ago due to budget cuts. Instead of filing for unemployment or looking for new work, Bethany had convinced her that the job loss was divine redirection, that actively seeking employment showed a lack of trust in God's provision. She'd been homeless for 6 months. Carol's husband had left her after she'd followed Bethany's advice about biblical submission, which apparently meant never disagreeing with him about anything, including his gambling addiction and financial irresponsibility. Each story was a variation on the same theme: vulnerable people convinced that their natural responses to tragedy, anger, sadness, the desire to fight back, were actually sins that needed to be corrected. She stole our right to be human, Jennifer said as the evening wound down. She made us ashamed of feeling what we were supposed to feel. Dr. Hendricks was taking notes the entire time, building what would become a comprehensive case against Bethany's practice. I've already contacted the state licensing board, she told us. She's been operating as an unlicensed therapist, which is illegal. The confidentiality violations alone could result in serious legal consequences. What about criminal charges? I asked. That's harder to prove. We'd need to show deliberate intent to harm, which is difficult when she can claim religious exemption. But the civil case could be substantial, especially with Laura's death and Margaret's medical crisis. I thought about Bethany's house, her perfect lifestyle funded by other people's pain. Good. I want her to lose everything she built on our suffering. As the women began to leave, many of them exchanged phone numbers. Not to continue Bethany's group, but to build something healthier, a real support network based on mutual aid instead of spiritual hierarchy. Jennifer lingered after most of the others had gone. Vivian? That's your real name, right? It is. Are you going to be okay? The cancer, I mean. I touched the port under my shirt, feeling the slight raise where the device sat beneath my skin. I don't know. The treatment is working so far, but there are no guarantees. The difference is, now I'm fighting it instead of accepting it as divine will. I'm sorry she used your story like that. I'm sorry I believed it. Don't apologize for being human, Jennifer. That's what she trained you to do, apologize for having normal reactions to abnormal situations. Dr. Hendricks approached us as we prepared to leave. Vivian, I want you to know what you did tonight. It took incredible courage. And not just because of the cancer. You risked everything to save people you'd never met. I risked everything to save myself, I corrected. The rest of you were just a bonus. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the middle of my quest for revenge, it had become something larger. It had become about reclaiming the right to be angry at unfairness, to fight against suffering instead of surrendering to it, to demand better treatment from the world instead of accepting abuse as correction. Marcus was waiting up when I got home, sitting at our kitchen table with 2 cups of cold coffee and a look of barely contained anxiety. How did it go? He asked, standing as I walked in. Instead of answering, I collapsed into his arms and finally let myself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears I'd allowed myself over the past few weeks, but the raw, ugly sobbing that came from months of suppressed rage and fear and determination. She's done, I said against his shoulder. Her whole operation is done. We have witnesses, recordings, evidence of malpractice, confidentiality violations, everything. And how are you? I pulled back to look at him. Tired. Scared. Angry. Human. I paused. For the first time since the diagnosis, I feel human instead of grateful. He kissed my forehead, careful of my sensitive scalp. Good. Grateful can wait. Until you're in remission. The legal proceedings moved faster than any of us expected. By the following Monday, the state licensing board had opened a formal investigation into Bethany's practice. By Wednesday, Tom had filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 12 of the women from the group. By Friday, the local news had picked up the story. The reporter, a woman named Amanda Chen, handled the story with surprising sensitivity. Instead of focusing on family drama or religious controversy, She presented it as a consumer protection issue, unlicensed practitioners taking advantage of vulnerable people during medical crises. Bethany's response was predictably venomous. She claimed religious persecution, sued for defamation, and started a blog called Spiritual Warfare, When the Enemy Uses Family, that painted me as a bitter cancer patient attacking faith itself. None of it stuck. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, too clear a pattern of abuse for anyone to dismiss as religious differences. The state licensing board revoked her credentials to practice any form of counseling. The civil lawsuit resulted in a settlement that compensated her victims and required her to pay for their actual therapy with licensed professionals. Her website was shut down, her social media accounts suspended for spreading medical misinformation. Richard filed for divorce 3 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting sole custody of their assets. Apparently, orthodontists don't like being associated with spiritual fraud. Margaret's lupus stabilized once she resumed proper medical treatment. Linda found a new teaching position and moved into a small apartment she could actually afford. Jennifer started seeing a real therapist who helped her grieve her losses without turning them into lessons. Dr. Hendricks and I became unlikely friends, bonded by our shared mission to protect vulnerable people from spiritual predators. She started a non-profit organization focused on educating people about the warning signs of religious abuse, and I became one of their first volunteer speakers. As for me, I finished my chemotherapy in February. The scans in March showed no evidence of disease. Dr. Patel used the word remission with cautious optimism, explaining that we'd continue monitoring but that the treatment had been remarkably successful. Any thoughts on why you responded so well? She asked during my follow-up appointment. I thought about it seriously. Maybe because I was fighting something besides cancer. Maybe having a purpose beyond just surviving made the difference. Marcus and I renewed our wedding vows that spring, 21 years after our first ceremony. This time, we wrote our own vows, promises about supporting each other through random tragedy instead of finding divine purpose in suffering, about fighting together instead of surrendering separately, about choosing love over fear even when fear might be more comfortable. Dylan and Ethan, now seniors in high school, served as our witnesses. They'd grown up fast during my treatment year, learning earlier than most kids that life isn't fair but that unfairness isn't the same as divine judgment. Are you happy it happened? Dylan asked me one evening as we sat on our back porch watching the sunset. The cancer, I mean. Because it led to all the good stuff that came after? It was a question I'd been asked variations of many times, by well-meaning friends, by reporters, by other cancer patients looking for meaning in their diagnosis. No, I said firmly. I'm not happy I got cancer. I'm not grateful for it. I didn't need it to become a better person or to find my purpose. I would trade every good thing that came from this experience to never have had cancer in the first place. But you're glad you caught Aunt Bethany? I'm glad we stopped her from hurting more people. But I wish I could have done that without having to go through chemotherapy first. He was quiet for a moment. She was wrong, wasn't she? About it being punishment? She was wrong about everything, kiddo. Cancer is just biology gone wrong. Sometimes cells mutate, sometimes they don't. Sometimes treatment works, sometimes it doesn't. The only thing cancer taught me was that I'm stronger than I thought I was, and I didn't need to be sick to learn that. 6 months later, Bethany moved to Arizona with what was left of her money. I heard through Marcus's mother that she was working as a receptionist at a dental office and had started attending a progressive church that focused more on social justice than divine judgment. I hoped she found peace there. Not because I forgave her. Forgiveness would take more time and probably therapy, but because I wanted her to stop hurting people, including herself. Jennifer sent me a card on the anniversary of our group meeting. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you for giving me permission to grieve. My babies deserved better than being turned into spiritual lessons, and so did I." That card sits on my desk at school, where I teach art to teenagers who are just beginning to figure out that the world can be beautiful and terrible in equal measure. I try to show them that they can create something meaningful from both the beauty and the terror without having to be grateful for the terror itself. Sometimes students ask about the scar from my port, still visible at the base of my throat. I tell them the truth, that I had cancer, that it was terrible, that I fought it and won, and that none of it was anyone's fault or part of anyone's plan. Some of them are shocked by this honesty. They've been taught to find silver linings in every cloud, to look for lessons in every loss, to transform every tragedy into a tale of triumph. I teach them that sometimes clouds are just clouds, that some losses are just losses, and that the most triumphant thing you can do in the face of tragedy is refuse to let anyone convince you that you deserved it, because the truth is this: bad things happen to good people. Cancer strikes without regard for righteousness. Natural disasters don't check spiritual scorecards before destroying homes. Children die in accidents that serve no divine purpose whatsoever, and that's not a failure of faith, it's just being human in a world that is achingly beautiful and randomly cruel in equal measure. The real miracle isn't finding meaning in suffering. The real miracle is choosing to love and fight and hope anyway, not because suffering has taught us to be grateful, but because love and fight and hope are what make us human, and being human, messy, angry, questioning, imperfect. Human is enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.